Tonight, for the first meeting of Newcomen Midlands for the 2024 to 2025 season, we have Dr. Jim Andrew talking about the nice parts of technical curatorship. Jim Andrew, apart from his long connection with this branch, he was secretary for decades, I think I can safely say. During that time, he was working for the old Birmingham Museum of Science and Industry in New Hall Street, and subsequently here for Thinktank when it moved here, as curator of most of their technical exhibits. And he's had quite a few interesting episodes during that time in relation to them and the members of the public coming to view them and talk about them. So he's going to regale us with that. I think there's good and bad stories, so we'll look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you. Yes. Don't be worried about laughing. There were aspects of the job which were quite hilarious on occasions. So, 1974, so 50 years ago, I was appointed a keeper at Birmingham Museums. Just to note that in Birmingham Council system, curators were the managers of council's buildings, and hence the term keeper was used for museum curators. I was appointed on my chartered engineer status because of regular museum visiting and learning from museums, and maybe important, a sort of general knowledge of technical history, some of which was gained from the books of people like LTC Rolt, because they were on the shelf in the library where I was supposed to be doing private studying at school. But it worked quite well. But it is necessary to go back before I joined the museum, because the whole background of curators comes to the fore in a variety of ways. Oops. Back one. I obtained 2 engineering degrees at Imperial College in London, where I also worked on the maintenance of the students' mascot, this 1902 James and Brown car. During my postgraduate year, in addition to grafting on applied mechanics, I researched the history of this vehicle, which ran in the Brighton Run every year and had been owned by the college at that time for some 40 or 50 years, looked after by the engineering students. This was not a raggable mascot. That was a dirty great brass spanner if you wanted to go and pinch something from the engineering faculty. But this car, as with a fire engine and a Morris truck for the other 2 constituents in Imperial College, it was one of the mascots. I arrived in Birmingham in 1966 with those 2 engineering degrees, this 30-year-old motor car which I and my father had rebuilt from a £5 wreck, and a fiancée who remained working in London for a year. I moved into a pretty grotty bed-sitter in Greenhill Road in Moseley, but it did me for a year. BSA Armoury Road, where I did some time in the BSA graduate training course, and when I was there, my office was up in that building which stuck out of the top of the building complex. It had glass windows down both sides and virtually no heating. I was actually sitting there in my full motorcycling kit, crash helmet and everything, and the phone rang, and I managed to knock the phone off the cradle and said, "I don't know who you are, but I can't answer the phone because it's too cold." A few minutes later, my boss arrived after which we got some heating, which was very good. I worked on several of their products, including the development of this. I've moved into development engineering side. Development of this three-wheel moped, the Aerial 3, which was the P22 in the system the company operated. And I'll come back to that later, because it's an interesting little study and to explain why we've got one downstairs, even though it was, in many ways, a disaster. The other one I worked on was the 750cc Rocket 3 touring motorcycle, and seeing the development of that really convinced me of all sorts of shambles within the motorcycle industry, not just in BSA, because it was being compared with other vehicles. But I became the motorcycle division standards engineer, not doing much with engineering standards. They weren't really interested. But what they were desperately concerned about, and they had no specific engineer to work on at, was the International Vehicle Construction Regulations. And so I used to be the UK rep on committees meeting in the UK and around Europe with the motorcycle industry representatives. I would go out with the director of the Cycle and Motorcycle Institution or Association, which we remember. And I spent a lot of time reading around environmental matters and things like that, which meant that when the firm went bust, I did actually have a little bit of an introduction to the trials and tribulations of environmental pollution, and managed by rather dubious means. Today I wouldn't have been allowed to do that sort of thing, but never mind. I was appointed to Birmingham City Council's Environmental Department as a pollution inspector covering a quarter of the city. That's industrial pollution and industrial noise, basically. This image is the city in the 1960s when the Clean Air Act was just starting to achieve some results. The interesting effect of this sometimes, we spent a lot of time going to look at sooty deposits, particularly on people's roses. For some reason, rose growers are very, very concerned about what they considered to be sooty deposits from the terrible pollution in the area. And we were endlessly explaining this wasn't, in fact, the result of the dirty air. It was the result of the clean air. Because we were cutting down of sulfur in the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide and trioxide, what was on the roses wasn't soot, it was mildew. Because in the past, the acid rain had killed off any mildew on their roses. Their roses looked much better in badly polluted air. One of those things that happen. Appointed again as a chartered engineer, but I did a postgraduate course in pollution control, which was all quite fun, especially as some of that was in the middle of the 3-day week when you couldn't get into a lot of companies to see what they were doing. And I passed the exam and managed to get my expenses. And I must be one of the few people who has now, as I have, spent 50 years in an industry, having been attracted by an advertisement which they read from the bottom up. Because we would sit out in the Erdington office moaning that we seldom, if ever, saw the council's vacancies before they were out of date. And this typical wodge in those days of paper arrived, and I scrolled it looking at the closing dates and spotted a date that hadn't gone, and read the advert from the bottom up to discover it was a keepership at the Museum of Science and Industry. And I was fortunate enough to be appointed, again on my professional qualifications and general interest, to a keepership, and very soon I took a diploma course and passed it and settled in. In addition to normal keepership activities of management, display and exhibition research, I was asked to deal with the inquiries from the general public about exhibits, about technical matters covered by the museum, including folks' inquiries about exhibits and worries about technical things, sometimes things they'd seen in the news, and occasionally even settling the answers to questions in pub quizzes and things like that. And that got quite fun on occasions. So there we have the Museum of Science and Industry as it was in New Hall Street. The guy got in touch on the phone and asked me, do you know what a Newton's cradle is? And I did. And his next question was, will it go on banging forever? Well, no. And explaining that it lost energy, of course, in the swinging, partly from air resistance, but even if you put it in a vacuum, it would still lose energy because it was making sound and making heat. So no, it wouldn't go on forever, but it would go on for a very long time. The old museum had an industrial coloured light paging system throughout the building. Anybody could pick up an internal phone and dial a colleague's code, and that colleague's lights would come up on a little display around the building. Mine was orange and red flashing. If you saw that, you answered it, and you can answer it immediately by picking up an internal phone and simply dialing code, and you were immediately speaking to the person who called you. And that really was invaluable for settling questions from people who wandered into the museum asking for a bit of service. You could give them some useful information straight away without going through the business of having to get their contact details and then sending them a letter later and so on. Around about 1995, an elderly gent asked an attendant in the museum, we had attendants in the galleries in those days, if he could find out about the hurricane that was sitting on the floor in the aircraft section, because he thought well, certainly he knew he'd worked on hurricanes in the Second World War, and just wondered, in passing, whether out of all the hurricanes produced, of course, he'd worked on that one. My lights went up, and I went down to find him. He thought that it was in the wrong colours, as indeed it still is, for its wartime service. I had to explain, and something that I'd known from what had been going on. In 1990, there was a lot of interest at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. And some of that interest was to lead to displays around the country of relevant exhibits, in particular hurricanes and Spitfires. The world contains a lot of Spitfires. It doesn't contain very many hurricanes. By the time the RAF thought it would be a jolly good idea to put a Spitfire and a hurricane on display on Horse Guards Parade in London, it looked as though there were no hurricanes left that they could try, other than going around museums like ours. And they came to us and explained the whole thing, and that they would take the hurricane away, they would have it refurbished, but to museum standards, which was very important, of course. And they would like, if we could give permission, that the hurricane would be refurbished in the colours of an aircraft and a squadron that was particularly well known for its performance during the Battle of Britain. And that is why it was given this colour scheme, even though this hurricane was built in 1943. He explained that he'd been an armourer in the RAF and just wondered if he worked on that aircraft because he used to deal with fitting the rails for firing rockets on ground attack operations. Quite unusually, that Hurricane has got 4 rockets under one wing and a bomb under the other. Much more a regular arrangement was to have 4 rockets under each wing, and his job was not just to fit them, but to align them, to harmonize them, the RAF term. The idea was that in an attack, when they were fired, the rockets, and you'd see this on lots of wartime filmage taken from the aircraft, of 2 rockets, 1 from each wing, hurtling towards a point, which is where there is a tank or a railway locomotive that they're trying to destroy. And that was the harmonization aspect, which was quite critical, because they're very critical setting the angles on them. I knew that such hurricanes carried this many rockets, and it looked as though the aircraft had got fittings under the wings. I said, right, okay, I'll go and have a look at the aircraft's, taking the serial number, I'll go and have a look at the detail we've got. So you can probably just about make out at the back P33 8 something. That's the serial number of it. And as we got the logbook, if he'd like to wait on, I would go and have a look. And so I headed up to the library and had some success. There was the aircraft's logbook with its service record. And so I came back down, and here is the front page of the repair logbook. And in particular, not only that, containing the airframe records and the operational records of the aircraft, but it had the armourer's records as well. And that was what we were particularly interested in. And looking at that, we could see somewhere along there, harmonizing the rocket projectile. So what I then did was to obviously get a better copy. And we could see there, RP for rocket projectiles to be reharmonized. Then the next column across, harmonization carried out. And there is a signature of Mr. Shepherd, the guy I was talking to. On the 25th of August 1943, that he had completed that harmonisation of those rocket rails. Oh, the look on his face. He'd come across an old friend from effectively 50 years before that he'd worked on. Oh, and he looked at it and, oh, wonderful. Eventually, he turned to me and he said, is there any chance that he could buy a photocopy of that page to show his grandchildren? Well, no, he didn't need to buy a copy. In fact, I'd already got the copy. I'd taken it while I was up in the offices, so I produced it from under the logbook. And there we are. He went up the road with a really nice example of a museum service. Now, we come across something as he thought he knew about, and it was great. And for us, it was great because it meant, you know, a further justification for looking after the exhibit. 20 years later, in a gallery below here, a young man was looking up at the Hurricane, which by that time was dangling in the air as we have them here. And he went to the front ticket desk and said that his grandfather had worked on the aircraft and mentioned his grandfather's visit all those years ago, and wondered if he could buy another photocopy of the logbook, because unfortunately, while the family had looked after the photocopy very well and it passed around in the family, he didn't actually know where it had got to by that time. Unfortunately, although well retired, the staff knew that I was in the building that day, and so I went down and saw him, said what the joy it was to meet his grandfather when he came in. I should imagine by that time he was no longer with us. So it was pure luck that I was in, and I then got his address, and the logbook by this time was in the records at the collection centre, so it wasn't something I could do straight away. But afterwards I got at least a couple of photocopies which I posted off to him. So it's just, you know, another one of those lucky situations. And this is the sort of thing that brings home to you examples of luck, or perchance the word serendipity is used for this situation where pure luck of a chance event that makes life easier for the curator and of course for the visitor. This lighthouse optic spent 80 years on the Farne Islands off the Northumbrian coast before being presented by Chance Brothers to the museum. Not quite sure how Chance Brothers were in a position to present it, as I'll mention in a moment. But in the 1980s, I used to run a small rally of barn engines, little, mostly petrol and gas, but some oil and other fuels, putt-putt engines, on the forecourt of the museum in Newhall Street. And at one rally, one of the engine owners mentioned that he'd worked for Chance Brothers, and he was on the team which had been sent out to the Farne Islands to dismantle this lighthouse optic, because it had been agreed it would come to the museum. As you probably realise, this is a dirty, great magnifying glass, a burning glass of prodigious size and hence prodigious power to set fire to things. Normally, these, during daylight, and obviously when the sun shines, there are either blinds inside between the glazing and the lighthouse optic to stop the sun shining through the lens. Because if it does shine through the lens, it will be focused onto the burner ring and probably melt it, which is not very good. The other way they sometimes got around the problem was by leaving the thing continually rotating. So long as it continually rotated, it reduced the amount of burning. So, in the case that he was working on dismantling it, sadly it hadn't quite occurred to them that this might happen, and he was actually standing on the burner ring when it set fire to his shoes. This, fortunately, didn't do him lasting damage, but it did give him a conversation point, if nothing else. And he made mention of this, and it, again, one of those things that stuck in my mind. Here is the lighthouse optic, and you can see very much how the parallel beam is brought down onto the optic there. The light that comes in from the sun on the horizon is a nice parallel beam of light, and it does the reverse of that quite happily. This particular point occurred to me when we were starting to design the layout of the exhibits here, because we were going to move the lighthouse optic to put on display in Thinktank. And we needed, you know, I raised the point about this and the recollection of what had happened, that we had to make sure that in Thinktank, which has a very considerable area of glazing to the south, that we didn't have direct sunlight falling on the optic. And For that reason, the optic is set reasonably far back from the window of the building, even then we do need to take care, because it's been found that even though it's not necessarily getting anything resembling direct sunlight falling on it, on a really sunny day, the temperature inside the optic climbs to an uncomfortable level. And so if they're going to do maintenance on it, the answer is to do it on a dull day. Nice overcast day is what's really needed with that one. As some of you know, much of my PhD research was concerning the Smethwick engine and the early Boulton and Watt engines. This is the engine, the 1779 James Watt engine, which is downstairs. That's just the beam level. It's an absolute beast of photograph in this building. That's one of the best photographs to give it an indication of what it is. But it's the oldest complete and surviving James Watt engine. And when we display it in steam, it's the oldest working steam engine in the world, so it's got something to it. What we haven't got at the moment, we have the oldest potentially working steam engine in the world. We haven't got the boiler that goes with it, because the boiler, which the present one is no more than 15 years old, seems to have run its life. Sad, really, these things happen, but yeah. That engine, now downstairs, previously at the old Museum of Science and Industry. Before that, it was being moved to the Ocker Hill depot of the Canal Company. And here it is being dismantled from its original site in Smethwick. So the engine was lifted out completely and taken to Ocker Hill, where it was rebuilt into a small engine house with no boiler, purely for preservation. Initially, they were saying, to pass it off, that they were going to use it for training steam engine engineers who would be working on this engine and similar engines still being used in the Canal Company. But after a while, they got so much kudos for having looked after the oldest surviving engine in the world that they gave that story up, and they became it was purely preservation. And they were very pleased with that. The exact site where this photograph was taken in Smethwick became lost. I had a fairly reasonable idea of where it was, but it wasn't until 1984 when I got deeper into the research on it and looked at things like the the shadows cast by the sun, which gave an orientation to the building. We starting to look at the old Ordnance Survey maps, very detailed maps from the time when it was still there, 1 to 500 in particular, that we were able to definitely locate where it was. And we then did an excavation, which I and Bill Brooks were heavily involved in directing. And we managed to locate the engine house and excavate it. And we were only 2 foot out in where we said we would find the remains. So that was very pleasing. In the process of doing that, well, of course, got to know it quite well. We had to remove a weighbridge office built over the engine site in about 1900. And here you can see me wielding a road breaker, taking out that office's brick foundations from amongst the 18th century brickwork. At other occasions, of course, we did use archaeologists' trowels, typical small bricklaying trowels, to clean things down. But occasionally with heavy engineering archaeology, you do get stuck with some pretty big equipment. Part of my research on the later history of the engine We knew it had been steamed in 1919 for the commemoration of James Watt's death in 1819. And to do that, we understand that they took a decent sized portable boiler kit to the engine to provide enough steam. I don't know how well it would have steamed. We've got engine indicator diagrams from those steamings, and they don't look terribly realistic. So we have our doubts as to whether it was really being provided with an adequate steam supply. But that's quite tricky because it's being run off load. And if you were to really put the full steam pressures on it, there'd be a big bang and the piston would make its way back to Smethwick. There was also a persistent rumour that it was steam for Henry Ford. Now in 1928, it's reasonably recorded, Henry Ford visited Birmingham to talk to the canal company and to look at engines which he wanted to preserve and relocate to his steam museum at Dearborn, his industrial museum at Dearborn in the States. And he eventually was given arrangements, and I don't know what extent he paid, to remove the Ashted engine, which, if I get my orientation right, is about 300 yards that way from here, and the Boyer Street engine, which is a similar distance that way, just on the edge of the Coventry Road, close to the Camp Hill interchange. What he wasn't given was permission, or even to open negotiations about the 1779 engine. The canal company did not want to sell it. And there was this persistent rumour that even though they weren't going to sell it, that he had seen it in steam while he was visiting. And that just sat there. Was it steam for him? And then this lovely phrase, serendipity strikes again. In the 1980s, I was a parent governor of our daughter's secondary school. I was on the interviewing panel for a new head teacher. There were several of us, including myself as a parent governor, and the guy sitting next to me, who was a representative of the education department, and several other people, plus the retiring head teacher, and so on. And when we arrived before the interviews, of course, we introduced ourselves to the group. Fine. And at the coffee break, he turned to me and said, I know about that 1779 engine that you're talking about, because in 1928, my father was a police constable and had to escort Henry Ford round the engine sites. Now, the Ashted engine and the Boyer Street engine were fine. They were within Birmingham City as it was then. But he also insisted that he wanted to see the 1779 engine. And it stuck in this police constable, in his mind, and indeed in his son's mind, of all the kerfuffle that produced. Because his father was a Birmingham City Council police constable. And if he was to go over the border between Birmingham and Sandwell, it had to be official. And therefore it had to involve the Chief Constable of Birmingham and the Chief Constable of the area covering Sandwell. Oh, goody. That was all sorted out. And so in due course, Henry Ford, with a police constable, went off to have a look, not just at these two engines near here, but at this engine in Smethwick, or the engine house. And by this time, the engine was at Ocker Hill. So they got to the Ocker Hill depot, which was the canal company's engineering depot, to have a look at the engine in this little engine house. And they couldn't even get in because they wasn't expected, so it was all locked up. And this police constable had to search around the site to get the key even to let him in. So Henry Ford did see the engine, but he didn't see it in steam. There is Henry Ford, as he was in the 1920s. That is the visitor's book. Very nice. Leather-bound visitor's book. And here we have Henry Ford's signature. And if we go in a bit closer, we've got a date. In April, where are we? 20th of April, 1928. We hadn't got the date associated with that memory of his visit to look at it. So that brought a bit of further information. So you're never off duty if you're a museum curator. You need to keep an eye on these things. Quite often, visitors to the museum will ask about an exhibit which they understand we have in the collections, but even some make special unannounced visits to see it. We don't necessarily have them. There are various possibilities. It may have been a loan of which they'd heard, but it's been returned. Or it may be that they are misplacing where that exhibit has been seen and it's not here. And usually, do a bit of explanation, and if we've got an idea of where it's gone to, or that it has indeed gone back to the owner, and if they're desperate to see it, if they write to us and we have the owner's address, we will forward their inquiry. We don't hand on the owner's contact details, but we will forward the inquiry to the owner. They're often a bit disappointed, but fair enough. But some of them can get very insistent and even very stroppy. We had a problem in the transport section. This was a 1930s steel-framed building, steel columns and things, which was the transport section. And the end there had already blanked out the windows, but from looking at the outside, we were aware that on that particular side of the building, the lintels, reinforced concrete lintels, were suffering very badly, to the point at which the structural engineer said, well, if you've got to either replace those lintels, or, because you mask the windows already, you need to brick up the window apertures to support the lintels. And so what had happened on this particular occasion, on the day that this cove had come in, was that the technicians had moved the exhibits away from that wall, closed them up. There wasn't any room for people to get round the exhibits. That section was barriered off. While they were preparing for brickies coming in to brick up the window apertures. My paging lights went up. And a colleague said he had a visitor who needed to speak to someone in a suit. So I went down to the transport section, and there was this guy in the middle of the transport section, close to all the stuff that had been stacked up. He was absolutely fuming. White knuckles, the lot. And going on and on about it. He wanted to see this exhibit, and we were preventing him from seeing it. He said it was as illegal for us to stop him seeing any exhibit, because if it's a public collection, as it would be for him not to pay his rates. Oh, good luck, lad, you know, carry on. But one of the things obviously you try and do is get these people away from the gang who are trying to get on with their work. I explained the usual business that, you know, if he'd made an appointment, because of course he hadn't contacted us, say he wanted to see this thing. If he'd made an appointment with his contact details, if we couldn't get him through to it on the day agreed, we would be in touch. But even if it was that, you know, he was still visiting to see that specific thing, then we would move heaven and earth to ensure safe access to it for him. As we got near the entrance, I finally asked him what it was he wanted to see. He was interested in a Francis Barnett motorcycle, and more particularly, he wanted to see the sectioned Francis Barnett gearbox, which we had on display. Now, to point out, we didn't actually have that sort of exhibit. We had sectioned gearboxes for motorcycles, but not that one. We had Francis Barnett engine motorcycles, there's one in the collection, but not the thing that he was after. At this point, his mate, who had been sort of on the sidelines earlier on, came out of the gents near the front entrance, and his friends, still in high dudgeon, shouted across the entrance area of the museum to his mate, "They say they haven't got that Fanny Barnett section gearbox you told me about." His mate replied, "I never said anything about a section Fanny Barnett gearbox." The argument was going quite well, so I tiptoed away and left them to it. And I understand from the staff that they didn't stay very long. But it is just an example of what can happen that really does take an awful lot of time. And the worst of the lot are the people who will then take their complaint about you not allowing access to a city councillor or an MP who takes their side. And then it just becomes very, very difficult. So that's just one of the not quite so nice bits, although actually looking back on it, it's really quite fun. Somebody could get to that stage of being so adamant. One of the iconic exhibits in the collection is John Cobb's Napier-Railton land speed record car, which held the record for 23 years and exceeded 400 miles an hour in one epic run shortly after the Second World War. When we were going to move the exhibit here, it would have been ideal to place it in the south-facing window where the public could see it, even outside when the museum's not open. But it is south-facing, and we were worried about that because the very strong sunlight would certainly have been a serious problem in degrading the very special 400-mile-an-hour tyres that are fitted to the car. So what to do? A bit of umming and ahhing, you know. But the project managers, who were very good, suggested that they knew a company who would do very, very realistic replicas of the wheels which would have been exposed. I don't imagine that they're cheap, but went along with it. They took one wheel from the vehicle and had it, and from that they produced moulds that would enable them to produce two wheels. There it is on display, and here is a genuine front wheel on the shaded side of the display. The vehicle is blocked up so that it's not actually resting on the wheels. So there we are, very characteristic of. Go around to the other side, and there is a replica on the sunny side, one of two. There was a slight problem in that they copied the lettering on the tyres, which wasn't quite correct, but that's the gold lettering. That was the least of the worry. It looks superb, really indistinguishable. And my party piece is to climb over the railing, or go around the end of it, with a group of visitors, and say, this is what you have to do if you're going to put this sort of thing on display sensibly. The 2 genuine wheels go into the store, so they're not being degraded. You keep an eye on the 2 on the shaded side to make sure they're not degrading also, because prior to that, the car had always been away from sunlight in the old transport section. And then I would go round to this wheel and I would knock it. It didn't even make a noise like that. It's such a hollow noise that it really does emphasise that it's not real. But after 25 years, there's no sign of any damage at all to it as a result of the direct sunlight on it. So we're quite pleased about that. The old museum, our library, was next to the general office. One day, the secretary, knowing that I was in the library, called out that she had a phone call wanting details of the maker of slip gauges. If you don't know what slip gauges are, they are sets of little metal blocks. Here. Right, I know what it is. I've gone too far. Too enthusiastic, sorry. They are these little metal blocks in a set of different sizes. They are very accurately produced to specific thicknesses, and with the surface, it's so finely finished that if you take 2 of them, put them like that, and then ring them, that's the term, to being in line, they will stick, and the interface has no dimension at all. So you can build up a series of these, and the overall thickness is the sum of the individual sizes you've used. Very accurately produced. They're used in inspection, they're used with comparators. So you set these up to a particular dimension you want to check on an item being inspected, and you then check using a comparator. You put the gauge under, see what the needle in the comparator moves to, put the product under, and it should be absolutely the same, you see. So, sorry?
You used to call them Joey blocks.
Yeah.
Johansson blocks.
Yes. So I get this call. Somebody wanted to talk about slip gauges. Well, I didn't know about them. It turned out he wanted the full details about the inventor of them, Mr. Hanson. He was a CDT teacher. He had written a book, and the publishers quite liked what he'd produced, but they had a series of queries, as publishers always do. And one of them was, it's no good saying Johansson the Swede. That's like saying an Englishman named Smith. They needed more detail. So I can immediately start saying, yeah, the guy's name was Carl Edvard. And I started to give things like his dates of birth and so on. And with a rather plaintive voice came through the phone saying, are you doing this from memory? Well, no, I had not long before been looking at our astrology exhibits, including some of the, and so I have been looking through various books on this subject. And when the phone call came in, somebody wanting to talk to somebody in the museum about slip gauges and some guy called Johansson, I was right by the shelf in the library, so I lifted out the guy's autobiography and gave him the detail. That was really rather nice to be able to do that. And there's another story in the biography which I like to repeat to people. In the 1920s, the American Ford Motor Company, who were making cars all over the place, they were renowned for the quality of their metrology work. And they started to get concerned because they were sending details around the world to their manufacturing plants. And what tends to happen is, if you're not careful, you have a set of gauges and you're going to check the product against those gauges. But those gauges invariably wear a bit as you're using them. So you have a higher quality gauge, which you don't use as often. And that works back until eventually you get back to the super master set, which is a bit like the Imperial Standard Yard, you don't touch it. Because it's got to be absolutely spot on. And Ford were becoming concerned because they had become reasonably aware that the American standard inch was different from the British standard inch by a matter of 5 parts in a million. Doesn't sound like very much, but when you come down through all those masters and submasters and sub-submasters and so on, it becomes critical if you've got a change in the master thing. So they called an international conference about this within the company, the representatives of the various bits. And they were all looking at this and what we're going to do and so on and so forth. And it was then after a thought, Mr. Johansson had been invited and he was sitting in the corner like a little dwarf. And he was muttering, I don't know why you've got a problem. You haven't got a problem. And eventually somebody, Mr. Johansson, why haven't we got a problem? And he said, well, all your gauges are made by me. I make them to the British sizes. And the Americans will never know the difference. So they use the same. Nice story as far as I'm concerned, and it fits very much with my experience. I was on the British Standards Committee for, believe it or not, British Standard motorcycle spokes, wheel spokes. And the nipples fit to them. And as part of this checking, because we were just starting to move towards international standards, and on those spokes, the thread is rolled out of the spoke standard wire gauge on a particular thread form, and that defines the dimensions completely. And I went to contact one or two suppliers of these things to ask them, and I said, what happens when a continental firm organises it or orders spokes? Oh, we're quite happy to provide the spokes. What about the dimensions of the threads on the nipples? Oh, we just use our standard. And that was the same. All the motorcycles on the continent were being equipped with English spokes because they weren't going to mess about with these other things. So, let's move on. I've already mentioned the business of refurbishing the Hurricane in the museum. That was in 1990, and so it was on display, and then it moved here in its reconditioned form. But the Spitfire, which has an interesting little bit, the Spitfire in the display downstairs was the gate guardian for the Castle Bromwich RAF airfield at Castle Bromwich, where it sat on display outside, as gate guardians did at all sorts of RAF stations. Fortunately, this one, because Castle Vale RAF station went over to become Castle Vale Housing Estate, this one came off display before it started rotting, and it's in fairly reasonable condition. A lot of the other gate guardians stayed until they realised that they were actually becoming a danger, and they really are rotted out. And so they're not really feasible for display, and certainly not for doing anything as dangerous as trying to fly the things. So that was the background. When we were moving here, and by that time we could see that the fabric on the control surfaces in particular was cracking up, we wanted to have the things looked at inside because we were going to dangle them here rather than having them standing on the floor. So we involved a company skilled in aviation restoration to museum standards. They came along and they took it away, opened it up, found that the treatment had actually survived remarkably well. The inhibiting treatment of the insides of the panels and so on was pretty good. They need to replace it, but nonetheless, it preserved the things. But when they looked at the tailplane, and on a Spitfire, these were metal framed with canvas covering. The rest of the aircraft was metal sheeted. But the control surfaces, the ailerons and the elevators were like that. And this doped canvas was cracking up quite badly and had to be replaced. When they stripped it off, they found that these were timber framed. And that produced a nice kerfuffle as to whether the thing was a genuine survivor of a real proper Spitfire. And they started asking around people. One of the things they found was that, checking with specialists, that a number of Spitfires had been refurbished for straight and level flying, ready for the Battle of Britain film in the 1960s. Was it one of those? No. In the Battle of Britain film, there were some aircraft that were checked out for aerobatics and so on. There were a lot of others which were just formation flying exhibits and used for that. It wasn't that. Eventually, they tracked down a specialist in America who was very knowledgeable on the construction of Spitfires, who said, yes, there were some timber-framed control surfaces for Spitfires that were checked to full operational performance and standards. But none of them survive, which the answer now, of course, is one does. So there's the framework, which was replicated in timber. And here a little confession. As yet, I can't locate the photographs of the stripped off control surfaces, which they provided to us, and they are in a file with Spitfire details. But we have boxes and boxes and boxes of details about the Spitfire, our one and about other ones. And I'm almost hoping that by confessing at a meeting like this, it will then immediately cause, as sometimes happens, these photographs to reappear, and we can get them properly into captivity. So I live in hope. So sorry, you'll have to take that on trust from me, that we know that it's timber framed. I mentioned earlier on the BSA Aerial 3. In the 1960s, a three-wheel moped, mainly for ladies in the days when many families only had one motor car. And this was to provide mobility, particularly to the wife. And two-wheelers for carrying a heavy load are not very safe. And so this was developed because you've got this rear carrier with two wheels under it, which doesn't tip. The front end is articulated, that tips, provides the cornering forces and things, but a single load can be carried on this much more safely than on a moped. And it was produced to the same sort of regulations of mopeds. And market research did their studies on it at the design stage, and they predicted that in those days, with the values at that time at a price of £95, sales would be good, as many families would be quite pleased to find a small powered device as well as a car. Unfortunately, having done such a good initial job on having market research done, BSA was a bit of an awkward company. And having done that market research, they then hit problems. The prototypes developed cooling and structural problems. They hit handling problems when they took them out to non-motorcyclists who would do silly things, or to them, silly things like putting the front brake on when they were hard cornering. Don't do that on a two-wheeler. The front wheel goes away from you and you look awfully embarrassed. And slowly, as they modified it to overcome all these problems, the predicted price rose to over £120. They didn't go back to do a further market research. If they had, it would have avoided what actually happened, and that was that they poured money into this until it failed to sell. And so ultimately they had to pull all the ones that hadn't yet sold, close the project down. Unfortunately, it seriously affected the company's finances, which are a bit rocky anyway, and was one of the causes for the BSA going to the wall and being sold up, broken up and sold off. Very sad, but not surprising to those of us who are on the inside. But the one that was brought to us, the one that's on display downstairs, was offered to us by a couple who had bought it from that remainder stock. They actually paid £95, the original price, and they thought it was wonderful. And for 10 years, they had used it, they kept it running until they could no longer buy spare parts for it. They were really sad. It was just what the lady wanted for her transport requirements, and they didn't want to junk it. Unfortunately, I saw them when they came in and knew much of this background, and I think actually it was a rather nice illustration of the importance of up-to-date research details on prototypes as they evolve and on market research. And with suitable write-up, which I produce in due course, it's a good illustration of poor product evaluation and marketing. And that case, it almost brought down a significant company, which had many other problems. It's no wonder they went to the wall. Later on, this layout of two wheels that stayed on the ground whilst the front end was taken on by Honda with much better engineering and much better market research, and did very well. Another little bit of the background for BSA and my knowledge of the company turned up when I had a call from somebody working for BSA Motorcycles, which is one of the bits of hived off parts of the BSA group. BSA Motorcycles, Triumph Motorcycles, and any other bits of the company was sold off to anybody who wanted them. This guy who rang me explained that they knew that there were many loans by the BSA group to the museum, and that they wanted a list of all of them. Motorcycles, guns, machine tools, and they wanted them all back. They'd already been in touch with the National Motor Museum at Bewley, the Coventry Motor Museum, and the Science Museum in London. And those museums had agreed to hand back the loan exhibits. Well, sorry, from my background, I thought this was asset stripping, and I was sure that no residual asset holder had been appointed when the BSA group was broken up. It was all panic and so on. And that any company had been appointed to become the residual asset holder. And that, of course, for all we knew, one night, and it might creep out of the woodwork, produce documentation, and make a claim that we had given away their items when we shouldn't have done. This BSA motorcycle company confirmed they couldn't produce any documentation for their claim. Now, in fact, I was sitting on committees with curators from the National Motor Museum, the Coventry Museum, and the Science Museum in London. And so I contacted my friends there and said, this is what's been going on, whereupon they withdrew the offer. The guy from BSA got well and truly bollocked by his boss, but could fight back because he knew exactly what had happened when the firm crashed, because I reckoned his desk was 15 foot to one side and one floor up from mine in the company at that time. That was it. So there was just one example. A visitor came in with this brass object about the size of a 12-inch ruler and sought an opinion for a friend of his. He'd met this guy while, I think it was, this guy lived close to his holiday home or something like that. They know each other quite well. So I opened it and had a look, and I had a closer look. And I hope you can just see that these rectangles actually have a slight shape to them, in particular with a bit of a pip halfway down each side here. And the thing that went underneath had 6 little indents that went under the various guides there. I looked at it, and I looked at it closely, and I said, I think this is a guide for a stylus pushing out dimples, forming braille writing for blind people. And he seemed quite pleased with that explanation. So he took it off to his friend, and his friend took one look at it and the explanation that I'd given and said, absolute rubbish, what a load of nonsense. Which is all right, except that I then felt challenged to try and sort it out. So I went off to a useful source of help, the patent library in Birmingham Central Library. And in there, I found very rapidly this improved interpointing braille frame. Not a brilliant photograph, but that was what it was. It was an aid to braille writing. Very laborious, but until rather later, when machines like giant electric typewriters were produced for punching out braille in quantities, so what they had to use. So, an improved interpointing braille frame. Photocopy of that went across to his friend, and he was very impressed with the service we'd given and offered us the item, which was actually slightly different from what I also found in our collection, correctly identified, but only later, and the part of the Charles Thomas pen collection. So that was quite a nice example of making a bit of a stab in the dark and succeeding. If you've visited the engineering gallery downstairs, you'll have seen this very large engine from Hull Sewage Works. This is by James Watt and Company, 1880s, came to the museum collections from Hull when there were 3 of these engines and were dismantled, and one of them came to the collection. But the museum had nowhere to display it at the time. The Smithwick engine downstairs is right at the start of the James Watt saga. This is right at the end of the James Watt saga, and shows that until the 1880s, the company was still producing top-flight stuff. Went into our store. Eventually, all in bits, got spread all over the place. The timber-insulated cylinder, sorry, wrong button again. Timber-insulated cylinder here, for years sat on the floor in the engineering hall. And lots of people would have passed it, and there was a photograph of the complete engine, right? But nowhere to display the stuff. Until we were starting, 40 years later, to plan this place. And we thought it'd be wonderful if we could get that engine back in one piece, not as a working engine, but as a motorised engine. It'd be very good. Decent day and so on. So we started to gather all the bits together. And then we hit a problem. These A-frames, very substantial, 4 enormous castings, had vanished. It's a bit embarrassing to have to put, try and caption an assemblage of the parts without the main frame to hold them together. Just couldn't find them. And then one of those chance bits of luck struck again. There was a repository in Bradford Street. I used to pass on my way in on the bus, on my bus route, where furniture and other things were stored. They were having a clear out of their warehouse in the 1990s, and they had found a steam engine carrying one of our inventory labels. Well, that was good. So I went by appointment to have a look at it. It wasn't a steam engine, it was a steam hammer. But as I was coming out, I spotted 4 familiar lumps in the corner. And there, sitting in the corner, without the nice green paint and so on, were these 4 substantial lumps. Oh, goodness me. That was really good. We've been searching high and low for these, and some of the bits had finished up in the Black Country Museum stores. Some of them were in our store in Derbyshire, which we'd had for a while. Some of them were scattered around various council depots who'd offered to store bits for the museum back in the 1950s and early 60s. And it turned out Ernest Holmes, the owners of the repository in Bradford Street, had been storing things like these at a notional cost. And then came along and said, look, we're not wanting to charge you for these, but can we just say we'll provide free storage for them? Because that would save us the cost of preparing invoices every year and so on and so forth. Wonderful. Unfortunately, if ever that happens, there's a grave danger of losing the link. And that was what happened with these ones. Now bear in mind, our lads in the technical team have been searching high and low for this. When I came back and told them where we found it, oh. Any of you who came down Bradford Street in the 1980s and 1990s would have noticed as you came down that there was a bit of a portico on the front of Ernest Holmes' furniture repository with a bit of a raft and sail and so on. It was the Castaways Club, which had degenerated, I'm afraid, by that time into a strip club. And one or two of the members of the team had actually been the far side of the wall from these things at a Christmas outing. These things happen. The other problem I had is one which I've decided to save for another time. These rods, which disappeared down to the ground, went down to crossheads and all sorts of other gubbins below ground, only bits of which we've got, because even those bits caused enough trouble with the depth of the hole without putting condensers and all the rest of it down there. But that's another story, so maybe another time. This fine 1912 BSA Tourer was lent to the museum in 1956, and it stayed on display until 1986, when the owner decided to sell it. As far as we were concerned, it was a very significant local product, particularly because it was one of the first cars where the car body, instead of being panels shaped over a timber frame, the panels were actually, as they were pressed, steel panels, and such timbering as was needed was fastened to the inside of them, so the upholsterers had something to tack the upholstery to. So, very significant item. The car. So the owner said he wanted to sell, wouldn't agree to negotiate with us. No, he said he wanted to be sure about the value. He wanted it to go off to be auctioned. And so the car went off to Sotheby's. There was an extract of their catalogue for it. It went for sale in December 1986. While we started negotiations to purchase it using a national scheme for museums to buy significant exhibits. Sotheby's estimated £9,500 to £10,500 at a time when my salary was about £16,000 a year. For some reason, our director couldn't attend the sale. No comment. So I, with no personal experience of auctions at all, was sent down with a verbal instruction to bid to well above twice the estimate, well above my salary. And part of the justification for this was this article in Autocar about the unusual construction arrangements for the panels. So I went to the sale and I sat there for the whole day making notes of the sort of the dynamics and the professionalism of the auctioneers and some of the stories one had heard about auctions being fudged. I don't think they are, not at that level. Finally, towards the end, the BSA came up for sale. And I nodded to the auctioneer at the beginning at about £5,000. And it slowly climbed. I became aware, in fact, that there was only one other person bidding, somewhere from behind me, was bidding against me. As the bidding steadily rose, I sensed that the lights were dimming and a celestial spotlight was picking out the auctioneer. I don't know what it was doing to my blood pressure. It passed my salary and got very close to my limit when it was finally knocked down to me. So it came back to Birmingham. And the final punch on that was when, having had it knocked down to me at whatever the price was, I think it was twice the estimate. Yeah. So it was knocked down at oh, I thought I made a note of it. Around somewhere 22, 24,000. So there was a little clerk in the corner of the auction room with all the paperwork. And of course the thing for any auction like that, which I was aware of, is that you have to have your finance organised in advance. And so there would be a suitable guarantee that the payment would be made. So I went over to the clerk, told him the number of the exhibit, the item. Oh, yes, yes. He rootled through his paper and he couldn't find the chit that showed that finance was guaranteed. But by this time I couldn't care less. I said, you're going to sell it again, are you? So we got it, it came back to Birmingham. When we put it into store, when we moved here, it was one of the items which received quite a bit of funding from a separate fund that was established to look after the exhibits that were coming off display at the old museum to make sure they went into the new museum store in good condition. And so it's one of those. So it's had quite a lot of work done here. And finally, to an exhibit which wasn't restored to museum standards. This MG arrived with us as a bequest, totally dismantled and with no provenance. So we decided to restore it as a runner, just as an owner might. Make sure that it was in good condition, make sure that it was safe and roadworthy, and not necessarily too closely following the original design. And I got to drive it around a bit. One of the things I discovered from the social history aspect was quite interesting. In the 1930s, mothers used to get worried when their daughters went off in a car like this with fast young men. I could have assured them that there was no risk of anything inappropriate happening. There's not enough room to swing a cat. There's so little room that, for example, neither the technician who did the restoration nor the mechanic at the garage, only it's over the back here, who did the MOT tests on it, could actually drive it. I did the driving because their feet were too big. My feet are size 10s and quite broad, but I had the advantage. I had an incredibly slim pair of slip-on leather shoes. Almost cripplingly slim, that I could at least drive the car in. And I was duly assessed by the council to make sure that I was fit able to control the car and so on. And so we did used to take it to one or two events. I could drive it around the city. I would take it to things like Centenary Square and so on for exhibition. We did trailer it to various shows. Since then, such things have become impossible. And so we no longer do that with the exhibits. But it was put back into use and it did drive nicely. You then realised how they'd managed to achieve it, because it's only the pre-war Morris Minor engine, but tuned to twice the power, basically tuned to almost twice the revs. And so you could keep up with traffic. The big problem with small powered cars of that vintage is that really they're not safe in modern traffic. You just haven't got the speed and the reserve. But that MG had. It would keep up nicely with traffic. And because it was intended as a bit of a not quite a racing car, but a high performance car, it had much better brakes than cars of that general design. And so it was safe to take out and use on the roads. So there we are, goodness me. 50 years of dealing with exhibits and with visitors. Often the exhibits causing more or less trouble than the visitors, and with one or two problems. And maybe at some point in the future, we'll have a gamble through some of the other things that I came across. For the meantime, I hope you found that aspect. It's not very much of a curator's time is spent on this sort of thing, but it's one of the rewards for the other management, dealing with the public and so on, that you have to spend your time doing. So, here we are.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting and entertaining account of how many years as